There we go. Thank you, Emily, for that lovely introduction to the Depave Paradise program. And hello, everybody, and good afternoon or good morning to those joining from the West. My name's Helena, and I'm excited to be chatting to you today about the Depave on Barton projects that Green Venture, the Barton Village BIA, the City of Hamilton, and landscape architect Adele Pierre have been working on in Hamilton for the past few years. How's my sound? And you can go to the next slide. Good, thank you. So since we're based in Hamilton, I'd like to start today off with a land acknowledgement that covers the land that is now the City of Hamilton, where Green Venture conducts the majority of our work. So Green Venture recognizes that Eco House is on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Attawandaron nations within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. We acknowledge that Green Venture is also part of this agreement and are committed to being stewards of the land. We further acknowledge that this land is covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase 1792 between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And if you want to learn more about the land you are situated on, as well as the treaties and agreements that have been signed across Canada, we encourage you to explore the two resources listed at the bottom there. So native-land.ca and whos.land. Next slide. So to quickly introduce you to our team, as mentioned, I'm Helena, Green Infrastructure Programs Coordinator with Green Venture. And for the past almost 2 years, I've been lead coordinator of the Depave Paradise program here in Hamilton. I'm joined today by project partner and landscape architect Adele Pierre, who is going to chat a bit more in depth about her plans for the sites, including the layout, function, and plant choices for our sites to date. And on the left side there, we have Jessica Myers, the Executive Director of the Barton Village BIA, which is a very active BIA, not only with businesses, but in engaging the surrounding community as well. So they've been a really great partner on these projects. And finally, we've got the Ward 3 City Councilor, Nrinder Nann, who is a great support to our depaving efforts in Ward 3, and of course represents the City of Hamilton, who are property owners at all of our Depave Barton sites. And I believe we have Carrie Leclerc, who is the Climate Action Community Coordinator for Councilor Nann, on the line with us today. So I'll introduce Carrie to say a few words in a little bit. And you can go to the next slide. So for a bit of context, this is where we're working in Hamilton. The map on the left shows mostly Lower Hamilton. Dundas is to the west, and we've got the northern part of the Upper Escarpment towards the bottom. This map was just created to show the boundary of the parts of Hamilton serviced by a combined sewer system, that's seen in blue. Just meaning that wastewater from houses is combined with stormwater entering catch basins in one pipe that goes to the wastewater treatment plants. So the City of Hamilton has invested in considerable upgrades to wastewater infrastructure, but basically the issue arises when heavy rainfall events overwhelm the capacity of treatment plants and combined sewer overflow tanks, leading to overflows of untreated or partially treated sewage into the natural environment. And even with added storage and upgrades, these overflows do still happen, and you can see exactly how often and how much overflows into the environment on the city's website. So of course, we talk about this issue a lot when discussing the justification and necessity of green infrastructure in Hamilton. So Ward 3 is indicated there in yellow, and encompasses a large part of the older parts of the city that are serviced by combined sewers. But additionally, in Ward 3, we have a much lower percent coverage of parks and open space in comparison to the rest of the city, and a much higher percent, over 50% of land use that's usually characterized by a lot of hardscaping. So in contrast, the rest of the city is closer to about 6%. As you can see, a much higher proportion of land used for agriculture in the rest of the city. So Carrie, if you want to jump in here just to quickly represent Ward 3, you can go ahead now.
Sure. Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, sure. I can just jump in. I'm sure a lot of what I'd have to add, Helena, is sort of going to echo what you've already said. Yeah, I think maybe just to add in terms of providing a portrait of Ward 3. Not only are we dealing with a lower urban tree canopy and less green spaces, there's also a less equitable distribution. So in some parts of the ward, in the north end of the ward, for example, we have folks living within an industrial core. And so the issue of all of the great things that a depave project can provide, assistance with the stormwater runoff, the CSOs, more bioswales, better air quality, all that kind of stuff is even more important in the parts of the ward, as is Barton Street is a great example. It's even more important than it would be in some of the perhaps southern parts of the ward. And we know that these projects are an incredibly vital component to sort of reclaiming our streets in a way, and building complete streets that are climate adaptive and climate resilient. So maybe I can pop in at the end. I don't know what else you're going to share, but maybe I can add some more comments at the end, but I'll leave it there for now and send regrets from Councilor Nann that she couldn't be here to join everybody personally. But yeah, as a Ward 3 office, we're super proud to support these projects. So I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Carrie. That's really great. Yeah, I will definitely send it back to you at the end. You can go to the next slide. So the Barton Village kind of cuts through the center of Ward 3, and you can see the boundary map on the bottom right there. So it's quite a large area spanning about half the width of Ward 3. And the Barton Village itself is a historical shopping area that's quite densely paved and populated. And in more recent years, it has experienced higher vacancy rates in commercial storefronts. So the BIA is in place to provide support to current and developing business and the local community through things like promotion, events, and partnering with local organizations on beautification projects. So their vision for the Barton Village is a vibrant, walkable community that successfully supports a mixed income neighborhood and that respects the historical built form while embracing new ideas and businesses. You can go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, all of these projects are on city property, specifically in the road right of way, which is adjacent to streets perpendicular to Barton. So our team identified a few of these boulevards that looked particularly worse for wear and weren't really being used, and in partnership with property owners of the adjacent buildings, put together a proposal to the city of Hamilton in 2019. So to quote part of the blurb that's really small up in the top left of Adele's proposal there, shade trees and native perennials planted in rain gardens would beautify street edges while reducing urban heat island effect, providing habitat for pollinators and absorbing rainwater back into the ground. Permeable pavers in place of existing asphalt would define space while providing an element of stormwater management. The goal of this proposal is to show the opportunity for significant placemaking, both culturally and environmentally, along a historic street. You can go to the next slide. So thankfully, we were able to start this project in the fall of 2020, and we're able to complete 2 additional sites in 2021. In these small spaces between the 3 sites, we added 13 trees, 43 shrubs, and over 300 perennials, and we're able to showcase 3 different types of permeable hardscaping surfaces, which is important to us since we want these sites to act as demonstration sites just as much as they are functional sites. So before we dive into each site a bit more, I just want to acknowledge that our depaving efforts looked a little different than usual this year, or the last 2 years, sorry. So you can go to the next slide. And this is a photo of our first depave on Barton at Edgedale Ministries. And as you can see, we were only able to have a small group of about 10 volunteers on the depave day, and then another 10 on the planting day. So that said, with a little extra planning and disinfecting, and despite the rain, it was still quite a fun and successful day. And in 2021, we carried on with our 2 additionally planned depaves, even though they were amidst one of the more rigid lockdowns. And we didn't really want to put any of the projects off, so we decided to try out some alternative forms of engagement. Some being that later in the summer, we partnered with Beautiful Alleys, a local volunteer group that promotes safe and accessible outdoor spaces, to organize a cleanup of Barton Village. So we got to chat to media and volunteers about the Depave projects then. And we also developed a specialist high skills major workshop and assignment for high school students with an environmental and project management focus. So if you go to the next slide, here's our 3 completed sites. We've got the befores up top and the afters along the bottom. And I just want to highlight Adele's talent here, as you know, all these sites were really meticulously designed with the adjacent structures and their intended use in mind, using different forms of green infrastructure to prioritize the functionality, appeal, and longevity of these green spaces. So of the 3 projects, you know, they have a couple different uses and needs. Looking at the middle site there, that's the office of an educational organization, Edudeo Ministries. So the space is used by staff, visitors, and pedestrians. And then the other 2 sites are a combination of commercial and residential units, one being very narrow with 2 separate entrances on the back of the building and a parking pad, which is the site on the far right there. And the other one has 2 doorway entries and loading doors for the business Barton Furniture, which you can see on the left there. So I'll pass it off to Adele now to dive into the details on these sites a little more.
Could you go back to that previous slide? I'd like to speak there a little bit. Thanks. Good to be with you all today. These are projects that are really close to my heart. As a landscape architect, you do all kinds of different work. You prepare condominium developments and parks and storefronts and all kinds of things in people's homes. But to create something like this that makes a difference to a community is really, really important. It's very satisfying. I'm going to begin by actually addressing one of the comments that was in the chat. And somebody asked, what kind of pushback did you get from the city? And how did you manage the maintenance? And I'm going to talk about that pushback right away, because every one of these sites, these boulevards, is actually owned by the city of Hamilton. So every single one of these, they're a corner lot, and from the footprint of the building to the edge of the road is public right-of-way. And that is really owned by Public Works, and you are not allowed really to do anything there without permission. So it took us about 2 years to get permission to do the first one at Edudeo. And I remember at one point, we took our little plan and we went to the city of Hamilton. This was pre-pandemic. And there were, I think, 9 different departments from the city in that meeting. And they took a look at it and they realized that it wasn't just plantings. There was all kinds of stuff happening there. And one of them said to us, well, this is a parquet you're planning. And we said, yes. And they said, well, that's our job. And we just kind of looked at them and thought, well, you know, maybe you need to do something about it. But of course, their hesitation is, as soon as they do something with that land, they have to provide for maintenance. So they're worried about taking up asphalt, planting stuff, nobody taking care of it, and that it ends up just being a refuse ground, you know, full of garbage and full of weeds. And so one of the key things that had to be arranged by Helena with each one of these sites is that a contract had to be signed for some kind of maintenance to happen. And I'll speak about that with each one of these sites individually. So it was a challenge to get permission to do these. After they saw the first one, then the second one, and then the third one, they said, this is great. Can we do more? So really, it just had to be one site in the ground before that they were convinced that this was actually something that could be done. Now, you've heard a little bit about this part of Hamilton, the North End, and there is very little green space, particularly in this neighborhood. These sites are all very close together. You can walk to them within 5 minutes. They are close to the industrial area. There is a lot of pavement. There are not a lot of trees. So we have issues with stormwater. We have issues with urban heat island effect. All of those things we've already talked about, but there's one other factor. In 2010, there was a study developed, I think it was the Hamilton Spectator that was behind it. And the study was called Code Red. And they mapped out different things like the amount of green space in a city and how it correlated to health outcomes. And I have to tell you, it was pretty shocking because this area of the city had the lowest amount of green space, the smallest percentage of urban canopy, the highest amount of air pollution, particulate, and they also had, correlated to that, the lowest birth weights in the city, the highest incidence of emergency visits to the hospital for respiratory disease and for heart disease. So when we're looking at something like this, we're not just talking about making it prettier and managing the water. We are talking about people's lives. And that's why it's so important. So the green space cleans up the air, reduces the pollution, reduces the amount of heat in those areas. And there are many, many studies that say that just looking at green space, looking at a tree, reduces the blood pressure and the anxiety level in humans. So these are vital spaces for a great variety of reasons. I'm going to keep looking away and looking at my watch because I have a tendency to get carried away when I talk about this stuff. So I'll try to keep track of it. And if there are many questions that come up, the moderator can just maybe interrupt and we can take some lessons. So if we look at these three spaces, they're quite different. They're different in their use. They're different in how they began. So if we just look, first of all, at the paved surfaces in the upper left, this was Barton Furniture. And there is a combination of all kinds of cracked and broken concrete. I think there was some asphalt here, but mostly concrete as well. And one of the biggest surprises we had, you assume that is solid concrete because cars were parking on it, is that when the excavator went in to start breaking up the concrete, at one point far down the road there, just near the corner, he almost fell through because there was an entrance to a basement. There was a basement entrance there that nobody had bothered filling in. They just put plywood over top of it and then put concrete on top of that. So you just never know with these depaves what you're going to find until you actually dig. So the second one in the middle, Edudeo, that was 15 feet deep by 60 feet wide of pure 100% black asphalt. Southwest exposure, it just baked. The one on the right, Barton Furniture, had originally, was not paved over, but it had a number of what I'm going to call weed trees. I never like to disparage trees, but these really were very bad trees, and the roots had grown into the rubble foundation of this site. I'm just going to stay with this a little longer and take a look at the possibility for trees. Because one of the first things that we like to put in when we're trying to green a space and provide habitat and is trees. And we like to use native trees, but there was a bit of a problem on each one of these sites. So the first one, again, on the left, it had about 15 feet of depth. And so, you know, most native trees will grow with a canopy of 50, 60 to 70 feet. You can't cram them into a space like that. And so we had to look at a smaller tree variety. I had actually specified a columnar white oak, but being the pandemic, there were issues with finding plant material. And so we talked to our plant supplier, NVK Nurseries, and they actually recommended one, a Carpinus speculus, that's a European hornbeam, not a native plant, but it's very hardy, and we put them in that site and it worked quite well. The one in the middle, Edudeo, these wonderful people had spent a fortune on this beautiful mural. So of course, being a Southwestern exposure, I wanted to put in all kinds of shade trees, and they said, no, please, please don't cover up our mural. So in that instance, we just put in one tree. It's a native tree and it's a serviceberry and it's in the rain garden. So they were happy with that. It didn't cover up their beautiful mural and they were happy. The one on the right, this was the tightest lot of all. This is only 8 feet. And so again, we looked at extremely columnar trees to put in there. We did find a quercus that was extremely narrow, and we put them in that site. And with any luck, they should be happy and thrive. They should just be fine. One more thing before we go to the next slide. No, I think we can go to the next slide. I'll talk about it as we go on. So this is the first one we did. This was Edudeo. And it is, I would say, the loosest planting plan and the most, not just loosest, but the one that has the most species in it. So we had a couple of things that we needed to manage here. One was that there was a downspout coming from quite a large roof and just going across the paved surface and straight into the storm drains, storm sewers. And we wanted to change that. So the drain pipe was diverted, and it was diverted into this small rain garden that you see right in front of you. There's the serviceberry tree. This is shortly after it was planted. And so this small rain garden absorbs all of the runoff from that roof. And it does have some small dogwoods in the front. I did use some cultivars of native plants because if you're on a small property, there's not room for a dogwood that's going to get like 8 feet by 8 feet. You'd be cutting that back forever. So we used small varieties. In the middle, the Edudeo people really wanted a site where they could sit and have lunch. They were very attached to their IKEA picnic table, and we kept that. In fact, they're looking at doing some different furnishings there, but they needed a site where they just sat. And so we used a particular pavement in there called Eco Raster. It's a plastic grid. You can fill it with just about anything, but we just filled it with a 3/4 inch gravel. It was very cheap and cost effective, and then put the picnic table on top of that. We actually have some creeping plants on either side of that Eco Raster. On the rain garden side, there's some wild strawberries and they're starting to grow into that pavement, which I think is pretty nice. And on the other side, there's some thyme that's coming in the other direction. You can see on the planting plan some of the perennials that we used. So on the far side, to the back of the photo, you can see a pathway so people can cut through from Barton Street over to the other side. And on either side is a huge variety of sun-loving perennials that are pollinator friendly. And also in the garden, if you look at the plan, you can see 3 big blobs there. Those are actually rocks that provide seating. It's very interesting. I was there one day just taking photos. I think it was last fall, and an elderly gentleman, and I say that tongue-in-cheek because, you know, I'm obviously not young myself, but there you go. He came from Barton. He walked down that path looking at all of the plants that were in flower on the way because a lot of them were in bloom in the fall. And he came and he sat down at that picnic table and got out his newspaper and just settled in for a good read. And I asked him about it. I said, do you come here often? He said, I love this. I just love it. I come here every day to read my newspaper. When you see something like that, you think, you know, that's success. This was in the height of the pandemic. Nobody was going anywhere, but this was a destination for him. Could we go to the next slide, please? This one is quite different from the last. This is the most formal of our sites. So this site occupies 3 different functions. So if you look at the plan to the very left, on Barton Street and Fullerton Avenue, at that corner, that is a store, and it is Barton Furniture. And then in the middle section and on the second story are a series of apartments. And then to the right, you can see the commercial entrance and loading. That is the loading dock and the warehouse for Barton Furniture. So this one, we really had to deal with more paving than normal, because really you can't, you have to provide access for people. And so the paver that we used is a type from, I believe it's from Unilock. It doesn't matter. It could be, yeah, could have been Permacon. I don't remember. It's a beautiful paver that matches that of the building. It's a historic looking paver. We tried to make the walkways as narrow as possible, so they're 4 feet, so 2 people can walk side by side. It's not excessive. We put a narrow band against the building to prevent any soil from going into the foundation. And then the driveway itself used a new product called porous pave. Now, this is a product that's been developed by those smart engineers at the University of Waterloo, and it uses all kinds of recycled tires in the mix. So when they're pouring it, it looks like asphalt, but there's a binder, recycled tires, and then some granular material as well, some stone as well. And the water just pours through it. It's amazing. We used, if you look at the plan again, you can see that there's the same plant material that goes all around. There's sort of a green thing. Those are a grass. So whenever I'm putting a lot of native plants in, I never want people to look at it and say it looks messy. You know, people have to change their idea of beauty. Right now, it's not with native plants. And so what I will usually do as a strategy is I will very firmly border the planting beds with one species so that the eye is caught by that and they perceive it as an ordered space. And then within that, you can go nuts and plant whatever you want, and it's still going to look like it was planned. So this one is being taken care of by the team that's heading it up, is actually one of the residents of the apartment building. So that was pretty successful. If we could go to the next one. Here you're just seeing the paved area, but you saw this one a little earlier. This was a third type of permeable paving that we used. So this is actually technically not a permeable paver. It's a traditional paver, but it was planted, it was installed with a permeable application. And so the installer actually increased the amount of joint space between the pavers, and underneath the pavers is that great big bed of gravel that one needs to absorb the storm water. So water is going through these pavers and into the groundwater underneath. Now, this was an interesting site as well because it was so small. As I said, we used 3 trees, and we've since planted a 4th. The added complication with trees on this site is all along there. There's a utility pole, a light pole, and there's also hydro wires. So one has to be so careful planting trees under hydro lines, because if they're not small enough, Ontario Hydro is going to come, rightfully so, and chop them back because they can't afford to have tree branches falling on hydro wires, especially when there's an ice storm. This one was hard to plan because the site is so small, but I was very pleased with it. This one is right across from a restaurant, 541 Barton, which is a community hub. It's a community center. When people come in and they actually have money to buy their lunch, they will buy their lunch and then they will pay maybe another $3 and buy 3 buttons, and they'll put the buttons in the jar. When a resident from the neighborhood comes by and they don't have money to buy lunch, they take as many buttons out of that jar as they need to buy their lunch. One of the most wonderful moments here is as we were planting, people came out of that restaurant and they were obviously have-nots. I'm just going to leave it there. And they said, "This is so beautiful. Thank you so much." And another reason I wanted it to look great is because there's a huge Westinghouse warehouse Just past this, that houses a major architectural and design firm, and we wanted to make sure that it looked good, that when people were driving to work, they saw this site that used all native plants and also looked quite wonderful. Could we go to the next slide, please?
Yep. I just want to let you know that we've got about 7 minutes left for the presentation.
Okay, so this is going to be very quick. I already told you about the people who said this was wonderful. As we were installing, people from the neighborhood would come and help. The more input you have from your community, the better off you are. If you just come in and do something and leave, nobody's going to pay any attention to it. So it was wonderful to have that input. So there was one amazing moment for me. I went down to visit all of these sites one Sunday morning in November, and there was a man around my age that was just ahead of me, about 2 minutes ahead of me as I went to each site. And he had a garbage bag and he was picking up garbage from every one of those sites. And I said, thank you so much. Are you part of the team that maintains these? And he said, no, but I love having these gardens in the area. So I've just made it my job to maintain them and clean them up. I do a bit of weeding and I pull out the garbage. And I thought, this is just wonderful. So everything about these projects as a designer has been heartwarming. Can we take any questions now? Thanks.
Well, we've got a couple more slides still.
Oh,
I
you
think
do.
that they want to do the question period at the end.
Off you go.
Thank you so much, Adele. I could listen to you talk all day. Okay, yes, thank you for going to the next slide. So just before the end of the season last year, we applied to the city's Urban Design and Architecture Awards for Depave on Barton, and we received an award of merit in the category of open space, public space, and green infrastructure. So I really just wanted to highlight the comments from the jury, specifically the highlighted text reading. This is a good example of a replicable and affordable way to contribute to streetscaping, illustrating how modest, incremental, positive change can occur in the public realm, which I think just really captures exactly what we're trying to do with these projects. And you can go to the next slide. So what are our next steps for 2022? We're going to continue to identify underutilized and neglected or damaged boulevards, and continue to build more community partnerships and synergize with local action groups, specifically on how to best serve the users of the sites and the broader community. So the goal for this year is to transform 3 additionally identified boulevards to inviting green spaces. And with that, you can go to the next slide. I just want to thank the funders for the projects thus far, and to all the amazing community partners and donors who made these projects possible. And we do have a thank you slide, but I'll just open it back up to Carrie in case you wanted to add a few closing words.
Yeah, I mean, just thank you for the presentation. I think I said to Helena earlier, I was already planning on attending this webinar today because I've been involved in Depave projects as a community member going way, way back. And the first project that I knew about was happening in a neighboring area of Hamilton, and it was at a church. And it was sort of, it was this huge sort of, destroying of a parking lot, which was kind of amazing. And what I've really enjoyed about watching how these Depave projects have popped up around the city is the fact that they can be scalable. And to the point that Adele was making in some of the projects along Barton Street, they can be sort of modified with the right people involved to fit into very small spaces. And so I think for my part, when I first heard about Depave Paradise, I thought, well, this is just something that's going to be, taking over massive parking lots everywhere. That's a dream. I mean, I would love that to, sort of reclaim our great infrastructure piece by piece. But until that day, until that can happen, I love the fact that there is sort of flexibility and malleability in how the spirit of these kinds of projects can be applied in our streets. And yeah, I think I'll just wrap it up by saying I think that having these projects take place in a really collaborative way with community members, especially in communities like we have in Ward 3, where people are accustomed to being stigmatized for some of those equity deserving reasons that we've already outlined. I think that's kind of the message as a climate action coordinator for my community that I'd really like to drive home, is that I think that we can overemphasize the importance of doing this with and not to communities. I think that's incredibly important. So yeah, really thrilled to have these projects happening in my neighborhood. I live super close by, and really look forward to see what else is happening in Hamilton, and I'll be closely following what's happening around the country too. So yeah, thank you so much, and best of luck to everybody on all your other projects. Thanks.
Thanks, Carrie. Great. So there's a couple questions in the chat. How are we for time, Emily?
I think we can probably take about 4 minutes or so to answer a couple questions.
Okay, I think the first one, maybe Adele, I'll read that one out. So as designers, have you ever been tempted to just layer new brick on top of solid concrete with cutouts as below grade planting rectangles in the interest of saving energy, labor, and money?
In a project like this, you would always have an issue with grading, because if you're putting brick on top, you're raising the grade 3 inches or so. I think if we were going to keep concrete, I would just keep the concrete or resurface it and do the cutouts rather than putting brick on top. I don't think that would work very effectively. So the whole idea actually is to get rid of that concrete and replace it with something more permeable. And it does take time and it does cost money, but I think that really is at the heart of what we do.
Yeah, and I can, sorry, I'm reading the next one coming. Just to the question before the one that just came in, for the residential projects, if we had a process of working with residents when planning or designing these projects at all. So for these 2 buildings, actually the one was being renovated, and so it's going to be residential. So the only thing that we really needed to work around was having that back door open access and the parking space available for the future tenant. And the other building, which did have residents, the building owner had a very good relationship with those tenants, and I was keeping them updated throughout the process. So we didn't work with them directly in the design phase, but they were around, chatting with us and helping out throughout the implementation. And I know that one of the tenants in that other building uses the loading pad to park her car. Have we got
community engagement? You could probably speak to that, Helena. What have you found to be the most effective way of gaining more community engagement?
Yeah, I mean, for another project, which I really hope to do moving forward in this project, is, working with the neighborhood association. So we already have partnered with some of the members of the community organization in the Barton Village. So the BIA is very involved and gets information out for us really effectively. But I know now that there is a newsletter that goes out by paper to the nearby residents, because not everybody uses the internet and social media. So I really want to connect with them going forward. I think it is quite a new newsletter, and just hopefully, have a little bit more time in planning future sites that we can have a bit more of community participatory design, rather than these sites were planned with the site partners and the users of those sites, but not so much just like the broader community. So yeah, our on the ground partners is just like the best way, I guess, of gaining more community engagement.
I think we'll call it there. So I just want to say thank you to you both, or all 3 of you really, I'm always so inspired by the projects out of Hamilton, and it's truly a testament to the passion and hard work and dedication that you've put into this project. As we know, Depave projects are not completed alone. They're collaborative community events that require the support and cooperation of so many partners. So